The invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 escalated a conflict that began with Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014, transforming it into a full-blown war marked by substantial losses on both sides. The question of how many soldiers Russia has lost looms large. While Putin may present figures suggesting minimal losses, evidence from Ukraine and Western media paints a starkly different picture of Russian casualties. Yet the toll of this conflict extends beyond the battlefield casualties. Significant damage to equipment, weapons, and lost territories underscores the war's broader impact. What do these losses indicate about the current state of Putin's war in Ukraine and its possible future trajectory? Let's dive in. From the outset, Putin believed it would be a relatively short war, lasting a few weeks and with minimal casualties. What followed were months of fierce attritional fighting, with both sides and independent reports claiming higher and higher casualties. With the severe underestimation of the duration and extent of the war, it was likely that Putin believed that Russian casualties wouldn't reach more than a few hundred or a few thousand. But then the true figures started rolling in. With a large chunk of the world focused on the ongoing conflict, at least until Israel declared war on Hamas, it's understandable that both Russia and Ukraine would want to twist the narrative in their favor. Indeed, one of the first reports from Russia in June 2022 spoke of only 5,900 deaths in the Russian armed forces. On the other hand, reports from the US and UK suggested that the actual figure was closer to 15,000. Ukrainian reports went further still, stating that as many as 30,000 Russian soldiers had been killed in the first few months of the war. So which figure is correct? There's no way to know for certain, but a study published in the peer-reviewed scientific journal PNAS suggested that there's a method to how each country displays its losses. On average, Ukraine reports nearly double the number of actual Russian deaths, but doesn't have a bias towards reporting their own deaths. This is possibly in an attempt to gain further support from the countries sympathetic to Ukraine's cause, such as members of the EU and NATO that are supplying Ukraine with military aid. On the other hand, Russia severely underreports deaths of their own soldiers at a rate of roughly 0.3 per one actual death. Any figure from Russia, therefore, should be nearly tripled to get a value that's close to correct. Additionally, the Russian media reports Ukrainian deaths at a ratio of a staggering 4.3 to 1. Meaning that Russians are led to believe that more than 4 times as many Ukrainians have died than have in reality. As a result, getting accurate figures on Russian casualties from either Ukrainian or Russian media can be a serious undertaking, considering the number fudging that the state media outlets do to further their own war agenda. Luckily, that's where unofficial reports from Russian media outlets and military, or reports from independent media, can shed light on the whole truth. One of the most notable reports coming from the Russian side was that of the Wagner Group, a private military group funded by the Russian government. In a May 2023 report that was mostly unauthorized by the state media, the then leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, revealed that the Wagner company lost around 22,000 troops and had 40,000 more injured. Based on that report and extrapolating from the size of Wagner compared to the Russian military, reports from the UK and US media suggested that Russia lost around 120,000 soldiers by August 2023, with another 170,000 wounded. This could support the numbers outlined in the PNAS study, which suggested that the actual deaths of Russians by February 2023 were around 77,000. As such, estimates by the UK and US media were on the right track, though the actual numbers are much more difficult to confirm. That's where BBC Russia and Mediazona, an independent news outlet, joined forces to investigate wartime deaths thoroughly. Unlike traditional reports based solely on field reports and those from the militaries, the BBC delved deeper and tried to individually document every death on either side of the conflict. This was done through not only reports, but required actual military records, the circumstances that led to the death, and reports from the person's local area, all of which would likely be more nuanced and detailed. In many cases, reporters went all over the country to extract information about the recently deceased from graveyards, parades, and war memorials, scouring for new names and graves. The investigators also searched for posts on social media from the deceased relatives and friends or obituaries published in local newspapers. The essence of the detailed search was that each death had to have a name attached. No longer were the numbers just figures that would pop into someone's head only to be forgotten a few seconds later. They were now real people who had died for their country, no matter how flawed the cause. This stringent set of criteria led to many of the deaths being overlooked due to the investigators' inability to confirm whether what was in the report, from either Russian or Ukrainian outlets, was actually true. However, with the BBC's backing of the data, the BBC Russia Media Zona report is considered the closest to the actual count of Russian soldier deaths, if not going under the real figure due to the aforementioned difficulties in obtaining the correct figures. If someone's name was on the list, then that means the person most likely existed and died during the Russo-Ukrainian War. The figures reported in October 2023 by BBC Russia suggested that Russia had lost around 88,000 soldiers 20 months into the war. BBC Russia didn't provide an estimate of the injured in that period, but the US news outlets reported around 170,000 injuries around August 2023, which was the most realistic estimate at the time. Better yet, the report was so detailed that the outlets could track down the deceased soldiers to the exact unit they served in. This served to create a detailed analysis of Russia's wartime efforts, as well as the average number of soldiers present in the Russian military. The reports from the earlier months of the war roughly correlated with what you'd expect most common deaths to be: younger soldiers on the front lines, with the average being a 21-year-old male professional soldier. However, the figures from the later months in the report suggested that there was an increasing number of former prison inmates in the Wagner Group and pilots dying than usual. This is important for two reasons. First, it showcased that the Russian military, despite a widespread effort to conscript more soldiers, was bolstered by those most likely unwilling to actually fight for the country and were coerced into stepping onto the front lines. Inmates accounted for roughly 18.6% of all deaths recorded by BBC and Media Zona. This highlights the extent of desperation present in the Wagner Group to bolster its trained military with people considered expendable meat shields for the more vital soldiers in the units. Second, the deaths of pilots meant that Russia was being drained of highly specialized military troops that it couldn't train in time to replace the deceased. In some estimates, it takes roughly $3 million and multiple years to make a pilot combat ready. This means that each pilot taken down by Ukrainian forces results in the grounding of a part of Russia's air force. Another independent outlet, Medusa, worked alongside the previously mentioned Media Zone to conduct its own study on the Russian casualties during the war. Unlike the investigation done by the BBC, Medusa relied on information from the Russian probate registries, which are used when real estate or cars are inherited when their original owner dies. By going through the number of open cases that use the probate registry, Medusa could approximate the excess mortality in the Russian population. This methodology is akin to the estimates used during the COVID-19 pandemic, where Russia obfuscated the number of deaths in the country for similar reasons. Since the pandemic wasn't over in 2021, Medusa had to fall back down to data prior to 2020. The news website published its full methodology alongside the sources the outlet used to make their claims. According to its study, Medusa reported that Russia had 25,000 excess deaths by the end of 2022, which was likely most, if not all, from the Russo-Ukrainian War. Similarly, the outlet suggested around 47,000 excess deaths by May 2023, just 5 months after the first report, showcasing that the deaths sharply increased in 2023. If we take these figures to be true, then the estimate by the BBC of 88,000 deaths in October is probably as close to reality as we can get. But those are figures from mid to late 2023, and the war is still going. What are the most recently updated figures? According to the latest data presented by BBC Russia, the total Russian death toll could be as high as 107,000 as of February 2024, and that's not all. When compounded with the estimates of severe injuries that cause soldiers to be discharged from the service, the total losses of the Russian army could amount to as many as 321,000. This figure closely aligns with the numbers published by the US news outlets, suggesting around 315,000 losses. This accounts for more than 85% of the troops in Russia's pre-invasion available forces, which were around 360,000. Of the estimated 107,000 casualties over the course of 24 months, the war resulted in 53,500 casualties on the Russian side alone. Compare that to the other notable wars, and the figure is higher than the war in Iraq, 2013-17, 50,095 deaths per year, and the Syrian civil war, 2011 to present, 43,736 deaths per year. When combined with the losses suffered by Ukraine, the death toll is a staggering 95,000 per year. This makes the Russo-Ukrainian War the deadliest conflict in the 21st century, beating out the Tigray War in Ethiopia. But the number of human casualties paints only part of the picture of the true losses suffered by Russia as a result of invading Ukraine. Also devastating have been the other military losses during the war, that of equipment and infrastructure. According to a February 2023 report, Russia lost roughly half of its battle-ready tanks a year into the war, crippling its ability to mount a unified offensive. This partly led to the drawn-out conflicts going on today. Yet another report in April 2023 suggested that Russia has lost over 10,000 pieces of vital military equipment, including tanks, trucks, artillery, and drones. In some cases, the losses were so severe that the Russian military was forced to redeploy some Soviet and Cold War-era tanks, which were veritable museum pieces in 2022. This is a huge downgrade in Russian military capacity. While the T-54s were among the peak tanks in the 20th century, their usefulness sharply dropped with new anti-tank weapons being developed in the late 80s and 90s. Today, a T-54 is no match for the most devastating weapons fielded by Ukraine that the UK, France, and the US have been steadily providing to the front lines. Furthermore, the T-54's 100mm guns struggle to penetrate modern armor, making them relatively useless in tank-to-tank warfare. Considering that is a relatively rare occurrence, the T-54 still poses some threat to infantry and light, unarmored tanks and vehicles such as the Soviet-era Grad launcher both sides are still using to this day. Comparatively, Ukraine has reintroduced most of its old weaponry, such as the T-55, but its fleet was upgraded with modern 105mm L7 guns capable of piercing through contemporary armor. Ukrainian tanks have also upgraded engines and tactical equipment, putting Russia woefully behind in technology on the front lines. According to some reports, Russia is even holding back its tanks for later use and trying to stockpile as many tanks as possible. This includes the newly built T-90s and the older T-62, T-72, and T-80s that Russia has pulled out of cold storage. As a result, most of the forces currently fighting on the front lines are purely infantry, and Russia is accruing more losses by the day. This could point to Russia trying to accumulate enough tanks for a final push in the future, and is using its infantry as cannon fodder to try and lower Ukraine's defenses as much as possible before that happens. While this might sound like a dubious plan by Russia's military command, the fact is that Russia has roughly 4 times the population of Ukraine. While of course not everyone can be conscripted, the attritional nature of the war could lead to Russia gaining some ground in the long term, since it can absorb heavier losses and regroup its efforts later. However, this has led to multiple waves of conscription efforts in the country, usually focused on lower density regions. This is partially due to the comparatively lower salaries outside of the major cities, usually around $500 per month compared to $1,200 in Moscow. Additionally, a military contract provides up to $2,500 per month, making it lucrative to lower-earning people in remote provinces. As a result, other reports from Medusa suggest that people in far-off provinces are much more likely to be the casualties of the Russo-Ukrainian war. The outlet states that for every Muscovite that dies in the war, 275 people in Buryatia and 350 people in Tuva die, which are some of the poorest regions predominantly inhabited by various minorities. It's not just the poor that have suffered over the course of the war. The conscription efforts have shaken the country to its core, resulting in waves of people emigrating from Russia to avoid being conscripted. If that wasn't the primary reason, then many more have suffered from Russia's attempts to subvert the public on how the war is actually going. In some extreme cases, the authorities have forbidden people from creating memorials for the fallen ones or spreading information about Russia's war efforts. According to some estimates, more than 900,000 Russians have left the country since the invasion. These are mostly people with the means to book prohibitively expensive flights or find other methods to legally escape the country. As such, they are primarily middle-class citizens, usually in IT and service sectors that brought significant income to the country via taxes. This is a huge blow to Russia's economy, but it's not the only one. Due to Russia's plentiful supply of oil and natural gas and the EU's previous lack of those resources, the country could command high prices on the market and invest significant funds into building a pipeline infrastructure. However, due to the invasion and most of Europe siding with Ukraine, that trade has trickled to a portion of what it used to be and has stopped altogether in some cases. This led to Russia needing to find an alternative source of funding to power its war machine. That's where China entered the picture. As a resource-demanding country with pretty much no access to oil and gas, as well as precious building materials and minerals internally, China has previously used overseas oil importers from the Persian Gulf. Recent geopolitical influence from the US in the area made China hesitant to fully rely on the Gulf as its sole source of oil and gas. For that reason, they had to diversify. Former Soviet countries such as Tajikistan account for a noticeable fraction of China's oil imports, but the country saw an opportunity in the new conflict between the Russians and Ukrainians. China positioned itself as one of Russia's biggest allies throughout the war, at least on the surface. It has not condemned any of Russia's military operations inside Ukraine and has consistently abstained in negotiations and discussions in the UN regarding Russia. Additionally, China has negotiated a significant trade deal with Russia for its oil, gas, and resources from the Siberian Far East. Faced with losing a bulk of its export funding from the West, Russia was forced to accept exporting oil and gas to China at prices roughly half of those the resources had with its Western partners. Despite that, the Russian economy is still going relatively strong, even if it's becoming obvious that a bulk of it is solely oriented toward its war efforts. But it's still suffering from the inability to trade properly with other countries and extreme losses in manpower and equipment that requires a lot of funding to replace. As a result, Russia's central bank reported in 2023 that the country's inflation rate is roughly 11.1%. However, the actual prices paint a much grimmer picture of Russia's economy. Some economists suggest that the actual inflation rate in Russia is closer to 60%, with food prices spiking up to 75% compared to the figures from 2022. If this continues, Russia could end up with a runaway inflation problem that threatens the entire country's economy with collapse. This is bolstered by the fact that interest rates in Russia's banks have soared to 15%. The interest hike is not the first in the history of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Shortly after the invasion, banks set the interest rate to 20% but lowered them to normal levels shortly afterward. However, it looks like the current economic situation is dire enough that the interest rates will stay as is. It's forced many residents to move their disposable income into savings accounts, with estimates putting the deposit rates at 32%, much higher than those in the Western world, such as in the UK with only 9%. The increased savings deposit can lead to a domino effect. With a significant chunk of money locked away in savings accounts, the Russian economy, or more accurately its citizens, won't have enough disposable capital to maintain itself. Regardless, the Russian media consistently reports that the country's economy is doing well, and the rest of the world begrudgingly agrees. The IMF reported that Russia's economy grew faster than any country currently on the G7 list: France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan, the UK, and the US. This paints a bleak picture and suggests that the war might extend for a couple more years. But is this growth actually sustainable by any standards? The short answer is no. While Russia's economy is arguably doing well enough to support its war efforts, all measures taken by Russia's government are ultimately patchwork solutions that will create an unbalanced, highly centralized economy focused on the big Russian cities. Additionally, if the conscription efforts continue, there's probably going to be a lack of available recruits from Russia's poorer areas. This will mean that Russia will finally have to aggressively recruit from Moscow and other big cities. These are the same places that are powering Russia's propaganda machine. Currently, Moscovites don't feel the effect of the war on their daily life, apart from slightly increased prices in the country's capital. Their standard of living hasn't been affected yet. But if Russia is required to pull their recruits from the same people that are propping up the Russian economy and are completely oblivious to the real state of the country, the wall of illusion will break rapidly. With that comes the potential acknowledgement that Russia has lost more than just soldiers. The economy is being supported artificially. China has basically made Russia accept any and all terms in order to have their plentiful oil and gas exported at any price. The rest of Europe has seen that Putin's regime is no longer as ironclad as it used to be and is heavily dependent on the core of Russia being none the wiser about the reality of the war and fate of the country. If that happens, the consequences for Russia could be catastrophic. The current prognosis on the war is that Russia can't make a meaningful push into Ukraine in 2024 due to consistent setbacks in obtaining the right equipment, most of which is being imported from China. That means that Russia is facing another year of uncertainty where it must push more people into the war's meat grinder to maintain a semblance of superiority over Ukraine, at least in the eyes of its most devoted populace. As such, the future is uncertain. China's moves in recent years suggest that it might consider attacking Russia for the precious resources and drinking water of Siberia. However, it's more likely that China will keep up with an endless stream of demands to either prolong the war or enforce its own peace terms on both countries to get the best deal. Regardless, it's most likely that Russia will become nothing more than a Chinese puppet, either exporting most of its resources to China in return for complete influence, both technologically and politically. Alternatively, China will actually invade Russia and take the country's resources for itself. In either case, Russia will likely cease being a meaningful player on the world stage and be forced to pander to Chinese whims. Of course, even these scenarios aren't certain. With the US hinting that China is not a severe threat to the world, It's likely that the US military has already poised itself to take advantage of any moves China makes and retaliate appropriately. But how? By cutting off the country's resource supplies to the south before it can recuperate from preying on Russia. That puts everyone in a state of stalemate. In any case, Russia has lost more than 1 million people overall, whether due to death, injuries, or widespread immigration, and its economy stands to lose even more. The fate of the country rests with Putin's current regime and whether it can gain a meaningful victory over Ukraine and enforce peace terms that enable the economy to bounce back. Otherwise, Russia may collapse in the same way the Soviet Union collapsed 3 decades before. But what do you think is going to happen with Russia? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching the video. Now, go and check out why Russia's military arsenal is low, weak, and outdated, or click this other video instead.